In this video, we're taking a look at the Sun Fire T2000 enterprise server released in 2005 by Sun Microsystems. It's a 32-thread machine marketed as a low-energy web-serving powerhouse. It's also insanely loud. We'll take a look inside and get familiar with the hardware, rack it up with some of its other Sun friends, and get a fresh copy of Solaris 10, Sun's Unix variant, installed on it. I'm also going to do a little investigation into an early 2000s Sun data center automation initiative called N1, with some help from a Red Hat Linux 4 install. Let's get into it. On the bench today, I've got this Sun Fire T2000 from Sun Microsystems. This one apparently is a misfit pig. I don't know if that's a fair characterization. These were announced by Sun at the end of 2005. Apparently they had a big webinar for it, as was the style at the time. But all that remains is this archived landing page from the Sun website. We can see Scott McNeely, one of the Sun co-founders and CEO at the time, along with David Yen, the executive vice president of Sun's Scalable Systems Group, which oversaw Spark development. It was around Christmas, so I guess they're unwrapping the Sunfires on stage there. The links to the webinar recordings are indeed archived, but they're unfortunately real media files, a kilobyte in size, so obviously not the full recordings. I think the real media player would have been reaching out to a server or something to stream the webcast. It's truly a shame when things like this get lost, so hopefully there are recordings of this out there somewhere. I find this machine interesting for a couple reasons. The first is this is the era in which Sun was transitioning away from the purple look of the late 90s and early 2000s over to this sort of sleeker, more mid-2000s silver look, as you can see from the front bezel. They've also changed the treatment of the Sun Microsystems logo here with this backing blue rectangle. For example, here is the purple styling of the predecessors. This happens to be a disk array, but the servers all looked like this as well. And then here is another example of the move Sun was making to this silver look and feel. This is another Sunfire, an X2200. We can see the same kind of blue treatment of the Sun logo there, just much smaller on this 1U machine. Side note, sometimes Sun themselves would have super tight kerning on Sunfire, like you see here on the front badge, implying that it's one word, but it's clearly two words most of the time, such as in all the documentation for these things. So the design language shift is interesting, but the second reason is actually what's going on inside this machine. Despite being a pretty big 2U server, there is only one CPU in here, one UltraSPARC T1. It's got 8 cores, 4 threads each, for a total of 32 threads. Sun trademarked this thread party as something called Cool Threads technology. So this thing is a particular type of workhorse, one that's going to do really well with multi-threaded workloads, like DB access or, more to the marketing material that they were pushing, web servers. If we take a look at the architecture of the CPU, we can see all the cores and their access to the RAM, of course, but there is one very important aspect of this document. The cores are all sharing this FPU box here, or the floating point unit. To greatly oversimplify things, computers aren't very good at floating point math. It's really hard for them. To be fair, it's hard for me too. By floating point math, I mean doing math on numbers that have decimal points in them. So anything that requires that, engineering workloads like flight simulations or data analysis or graphical rendering, this thing is just absolutely gonna drag at. But that was a trade-off Sun was making with the UltraSPARC T1 processor in here, with the killer feature being less power consumption. In review articles at the time, they call out this machine as fitting a specific need, and that need was serving websites. An InfoWorld article cites a Sun case study where a web server farm was able to replace 1,000 Intel servers with 406 of these Sunfire T2000s and reduce their operating costs from $2.3 million a year to $550,000 a year at comparable performance. The reviewer concludes the article with, "If it's threaded performance you're after, give the T2000 a look." The design shift and the use case make this machine in particular pretty interesting to me as an artifact of mid-2000s enterprise computing. So let's have a look around this thing, get to know what it's all about physically. We'll open it up and see what's inside, and we'll go from there. Starting on the front, we've got this locator LED. So I believe you can turn this on remotely, and then you could come over to the rack. You might have 400 of these racked up, and you can turn the one on for the machine you want to service, which will just help you find it in the rack. And this one's actually kind of interesting. It appears to be a button that you can press, and my hunch is that when you press that, a indicator on the back also turns on. So remember, you're in rows and rows of these and you got to walk around a cage. If you're in the front, you know you want to mess with this one. Click the indicator, go to the back, and I suspect there's a light back there. We'll see. A couple USB ports on the front here. We've got a fault indicator light. I think that'll go amber if something's wrong with the machine. Got the OK green light. Hopefully that's all we see today. This is a power switch, power button. Really small. You can tell a bunch of people have been in there with like ballpoint pens, I think. We've got this top fan indicator. We'll take a look soon, but there's a hatch on the top with a bunch of fans, and I suspect when there is an issue with one of those, this will go off. Got a rear fan indicator. There's fans in the back, of course, and then an over temperature fault LED right here. On the right side, we've got this pretty sleek looking DVD drive, spots for 4 tiny little hard drives, and these are all filler trays. So if we pull one of these out, I can't actually put a hard drive in these. These are just to fill in the empty spots for airflow reasons. The good news is I've got some accessories. A viewer named Cooper reached out and sent me all this for the price of shipping, which is a screaming deal, so a huge thanks to them. It's my understanding that the only thing wrong with this machine is that some of the RAM doesn't work. So if you remember back to our diagram, the RAM is in different banks, I think, and I guess one or more of them don't work, so we might just have partial RAM. We'll have to investigate that. But I've got a hard drive with tray, so this is a slightly different tray than the filler card, so we'll be able to slide that in there. This looks pretty much either refurbished or brand new. Got this card that I am not familiar with. To refresh my memory here. I do not know what this is off the top of my head. Maybe like a remote management card or something. It's got a tiny little battery on it. I'll have to look up that part number after we open it up. A couple extra DDR2 RAMs, and then a spare processor. It's funny, in the marketing material, they always make these things like look super sweet, and you're like, yeah, I want to see one of those. Let me show you what it actually looks like. I mean, it's still cool, obviously, but it's not nearly as cool as the documentation. An UltraSPARC T1, and if we flip it around, we'll see no pins. It's one of those sort of flat surface deals. Just presses on there. Kind of cool. It looks like it's in really good shape. I believe this one works. So we'll have a backup just in case. I'll put that back in its bag. The top of the machine on this front section, of course, we've got the nice diagrams. There's more up there I'll show you. We've got this fan access bay. It just lifts up pretty nicely like that. And we've got at least 3 fans. Let's see. These should be hot swappable. I think that's what the orange means. There's the lift handle. I'm trying to figure out how it works. Oh yeah, okay. There we go. So yeah, these pop out. If that goes bad, these are pretty big. If that goes bad, you can swap them out while the machine is running in the rack. That's a pretty common feature. What's this? It says, Sun for safety, do not remove. I think it's just a air baffle. Maybe we'll remove that later. And yes, these are indeed hot swappable. And it looks like under that baffle, you might be able to install 6 total fans, and mine only has 3. I don't know what the deal with that is. On the inside of the lid, there's even more instructions for entire fan board removal. This is specifically called out as a cold swap. You got to power down the system. You remove a couple screws, and I think you can take like this whole assembly out or something. And it says, do not leave fan door open for more than 60 seconds while the system is running. Overheat hazard. The rest of the case is covered with these diagrams about service. This is pretty typical with enterprise machines. I always find it fun to see how the different companies diagram and document their things. IBM is really heavy on everything having like a little hierarchical part number. Sun wasn't too big on that. Got the general service stuff, what all those LED indicators mean. That's how I learned all that. This is important, the procedure color coding. So red or orange, you can hot swap. Blue means it's a cold swap. System must be powered off. That's pretty typical. We've got power supply removal, blower removal, PCI card stuff, how to rack it, some DVD service information. So that was indeed a DVD drive. Around back, we've got dual power supplies. They're these thin, long ones. Let's pull one out. Come out no problem. They look like that. Everything on this machine is very clean so far. I haven't opened the lid yet. We'll do that together, but I'm liking what I'm seeing. Taking a look at our port situation, we've got a serial port here. We've got a PCI Express card. One is installed. It looks like it's fiber, so that's kind of cool. Probably 1 gig fiber or something for this machine. Got a serial management port. It's an RJ45 port, so it looks like a network jack, but it's not. You can use one of these RJ45 to serial adapters to get your computer hooked up to this thing through that port. What's nice about Sun is they use the Cisco wiring standard, so I can use these Cisco cables on all my Sunfires. Right up here is one labeled a net management port. So this would be actually a network jack, I think, that gives you access. This thing probably has something called an ALOM, which stands for Advanced Lights Out Management. The Sun remote management system was called Lights Out Management. And as they progressed into the mid-2000s, the ALOM came out, Advanced Lights Out Management. It was just a new iteration of it. I suspect that's what this one has. I've actually never done net management of any of my Sunfires, and I have a bunch that have these ports. I might have to do a dedicated video just covering all the differences. And down here, I think I was right, that's a button. A little click button as an indicator. I suspect that button is also a light. So the one on the front, you'd press it and this one would light up, and probably vice versa here. And this is a nice feature, in my opinion, that is pretty typical. So we've got the warning indicator and the OK light on the back as well. Remember, when you're in a data center, there's just racks and racks of these things. It might take you a few minutes to get to the front of wherever your machine is. So it's nice to be able to see everything from both sides. 2 USB ports back here as well. And then this is what you like to see. 4 built-in NICs, 10 100 1 gigabit NICs. This is just classic Sun. Everything was about networking. This machine is a web server. Really like to see that. Over here we've got some more slots. It looks like we've got a PCI Express, and then 2 PCI-X slots. PCI-X was another standard I didn't even know about until I started getting into this enterprise hardware stuff. I think it was really only in the enterprise, and it was before PCI Express took off. And it's kind of cool, actually, to have a machine that can do both, even if it's these half-height cards. That might come in handy. This one's populated, so that's either going to be the SCSI controller or some sort of disk controller for the hard drives on the front. They might have had to dedicate a slot to that, or maybe something to do with the remote management, the ALOM. Maybe that lives on a card. Place your bets. We're about to take the lid off. And then something else was going on here. In its service life, there was probably another NIC there or something. Let's open this thing up. I have not been in here before. I will say this machine is surprisingly light for what it is. That being said, it's solid. I don't know how else to explain it other than it feels good to hold this thing and push it around. It's very solid, but for the punch that it's packing, I suspect, it's quite light, all things considered, in the enterprise world. I think you just press this button, I guess. Yeah, there, we're already sliding. That's nice and easy. Must have latched here. Man, it would have been just a absolute sight to see all of these racked up, hundreds of these. Wow. Got the 2 power supplies here with a blower assembly of some type, sucking hot air off of them. I'm going to flip this thing around. Wow, look how tidy this thing is. Just everything is just packed in here really nicely. This, I was right. Who had their money on disk controller? This looks like SATA? Yeah, serial ATA cables for those 1, 2, 3, 4 disks in the front. Maybe space constraints. They had to dedicate a slot right out of the factory for that. At least they used one of those PCI-X slots, not one of your PCI Express, I suppose. Here's that same card that I wasn't familiar with. The one I've got a spare of. Let me go look up that part number. My money is on remote management. Yep, sure enough, this is a system service processor, apparently. So that is going to be the remote management card. Then that PCI card right behind it that I thought might be a network card is a fiber channel card. So that is actually for hooking up like disk arrays over fiber via something called fiber channel. I am going to be exploring fiber channel on some IBM units in the future, this year for sure. So that's exciting to have another one of these cards. And maybe we can get this in the mix with some fiber channel disk shelves or something. Very cool. And then over here we've got the UltraSPARC T1 hiding behind this heatsink. We'll leave him there. And at least physically, we're fully populated with RAM. Let's pull one out. 512 megabyte. Ew. It's got the Sun FRU numbers though. Might have come with the system. Just going to pull a random one from these banks over here. I suspect they're the same. Yeah, a bunch of 512 sticks. So what would that give us total? 1, 2, 3, 4, 8 gigs of RAM, baby. One last thing of note, the system is actually broken into 2 boards. The sort of input-output board over here and the main board with the RAM and the CPU. And it's got this massive like interconnect bus. I think maybe that's a ribbon card or cable of some sort. I'm not sure. But it's pretty beefy between the 2 pieces. Well, I think that's all there is to show. I guess we got to put the lid back on. I'll hook up to that serial remote management port, and we'll see how loud this thing is. Just because I'm sure you were dying to know. For posterity, there's this massive metal baffle that inserts itself right here, and it's got a cutout, presumably for the SATA cables to kind of sit in, I guess. Pretty overbuilt, I would say. I'm not one for plastic, but probably could have been plastic. But you'll love to see it. Even more documentation on the back of it, actually, about removing that processor board, the SAS controller, all sorts of stuff. Wow. Just because I can't stop talking. Yeah, that little slot that I was showing you perfectly fits on the cables here, and you can actually see just barely where they're just starting to wear and get scraped over the years. I don't think this has been off very much. It's interesting that they didn't use any sort of like grommeting. This isn't, I wouldn't call this sharp, like I'm not cutting myself or anything, but not good for cables. And they're probably just in there vibrating a bunch. Okay, I'm done, I promise. Got a serial cable plugged in to the serial management port and a power cable plugged in. The serial port is connected up to PuTTY here on my Windows machine. I'm gonna give the thing power, and we'll see if we can get an OK prompt from that ALOM. And I don't think it's gonna turn on. I think it's on. Unless that might just be the power supply fans. That's scary. It was an ALOM. Okay. It's doing a memory cells test. And based on what Cooper told me when they donated this, I would expect something to fail here, but that might be okay. Shows what I know. That might not have been a thorough memory test, so once we get in, hopefully we don't have a password and have to deal with that. Should be able to perform some more thorough checks. Yeah, I am sad to say I think those are just the power supply fans. Loading runtime image. This is good though. Healthy so far. There we go. The Advanced Lights Out Manager. CMT165. I don't know what CMT stands for. Look at that. System memory downgraded to 2-channel mode from 4-channel mode. What's odd is that it knows there's 8 total physical gigs in there, and it's only going to give me 4. Might have to troubleshoot that. And it wants me to log in. Let me go see what the default user pass on this ALOM is. Tried the usual suspects, admin blank, admin, admin. It might be admin and then the last 8 of the chassis serial number, but I also was reading the fans rev up when you turn the power off. That's nice. I'm going to restart it, or cut the power, which I just did, and then I'll bring it back up. I should be able to hit escape while the ALOM is booting, and that'll get me into a little diagnostics menu. Let's see. You should see it come back on. I press escape. Hopefully. It might do all this first. There we go. Look at this. I'm in the ALOM escape menu. I'm going to say E for erase ALOM NVRAM. Okay, and then I'm going to return to bootmon. And this should be defaults, which might still be that chassis serial number that I might have to go look up. We'll see. We're in. After letting it continue its boot sequence, you can see we're at the SC prompt. It just automatically logged me in with a user of admin and no password. Let's poke around a little bit. I'm not familiar with this one. Oh boy. We're going to do a boot mode 4th. And it forces me to set a password for admin. I'm going to make it admin. Password has been accepted but does not meet recommended guidelines. I will say it's really nice that I was able to very easily reset this. If I have physical access to the machine, like from a security standpoint, you're already cooked. Like, hopefully you encrypted the hard drives. So it's nice when these enterprise manufacturers let you just really easily reset it. Well documented. I love it. We're going to get to the next level and see how loud this thing is. I'm going to do a power on. Oh yeah. A little bit louder. Holy crap. So those were just the power supplies. And now the whole thing is coming up. And we're going to get to the OK prompt, I think. She's a little loud. I'm going to give you the full experience without noise canceling now. Yikes. It just restarted itself for some reason. Got this host system is shut down. And the last thing it spit out was master set ACK for VBSC run post command. I don't know what that means. Maybe that's normal. We are here. Let's do a probe SCSI all. This is going to go through and look at all the devices, basically. So this thing doesn't have any hard drives, which is fine. Whew. That thing is real loud. I don't know how much longer it's going to be in this room with me for the rest of this video. Solaris 10 would be a era-appropriate operating system for this thing. I found the SPARC version of Solaris 10 from November of 2006 on the Internet Archive. I'm going to get this burnt to a disk. And I know, people don't like optical media. It's sort of nostalgic for me. I like burning a disk, putting it in. There's lots of fancy ways you could boot this over the net, but I don't feel like doing that. And let's see, we're going to pull one of our filler cards here. This is slot 0, aka the first hard drive slot, not that it really matters. And we'll open up our other one here. Got a bunch of details on it. Sun branded 73 gig, 10,000 RPM SAS drive. And we can see a quality assurance note from whoever's still selling these things from July of 2024, which implies to me that there are a lot of these bad boys still in service. I can just tell I'm gonna like this machine. Something about it just feels right. Here we got this cute little guy. This was manufactured April of 2007. It's a Fujitsu drive. That was pretty typical. Like, Sun must have had a big contract with them, but it's a Sun branded part, so OEM, you could say. And then, of course, this isn't a filler drive, so it's got some LED indicators and little light tubes. So there's going to be some LEDs deep in there that are traveling through these plastic tubes out to here. That's nice. Open up this little guy here and should be able to slide that in. Yep, very nice. Pull out the old DVD burning setup. We'll get image burn cooking away. What a classic. And I will be back when this is done. Got my Solaris 10 install media here. I think I'm going to move this into another room. It is way too loud to be sitting in here installing an OS on. I got it sitting in here with its other Sun friends here on what I am lovingly calling the retro rack. Just above that you can see the beginnings of the network I'm building here. So we've got this Cisco Catalyst switch, and this Cisco 7200 VXR is the router. And most importantly, I've got something called a terminal server. So this happens to be a Cisco 2500 series router, and it can actually allow me to remotely manage that Sun down there over its serial console, the one I was showing you that I was plugging my serial console cable into, over the network. So I'll be able to remotely manage this thing in the other room, and it can make as much noise as it wants to in here. The side view here to try to explain this. There's this special cable coming off that terminal server with a bunch of RJ45 serial cords, and I can plug this into up to 8 devices. Basically, I can manage them. Around back, the T2000, I've got one of those cables extended with this one. I'll plug it right into the serial port. So let's bring the retro rack to life here. Get all this equipment powered up and loaded. Now in here where it's quiet without that machine, I telnetted in to that terminal server and I can see the console remotely of that T2000. I'm going to power it on. I can just barely hear it over there. Go to the console. I'll wait for this to boot up and we'll see if we can see that hard drive. And this time, after issuing a probe SCSI all, it sees our drive, that Fujitsu drive with 73 gigs. Just issued a dev alias just to see if it can find everything, and it does know about the CD-ROM, or it thinks it does anyway. I think, it's been a while, I can just do boot CD-ROM. Boot read fail. Bad magic number and disk label. Oh, you're probably yelling at your screen. I tried to boot from the CD-ROM, and then it tried to boot from the disk I just put in, because it didn't understand what that meant. So I'll say boot CD-ROM. See if we get any difference here. Yeah, now it found that boot device. Hopefully it works. It was a little crusty accepting the disk, to be honest. Took a while. It's kind of bizarre. There's no indicator lights on that DVD-ROM drive, which is sort of strange, but it seems to be working. It found SunOS 510, which is Solaris 10, what I put on that DVD. It's slowly attempting to configure the interfaces, the NICs, and it takes a while and fails, and you can see I panicked and ran in there and got port 0 in there onto the home lab, the retro rack network, in case I need it. I only like to install OSs that have to set up Java before continuing. I was talking all that talk about DVDs, but man, it is slow. We are in the installer. We're going to have to format the disk. It might just do that as part of the natural installation flow. I can't remember. Was breezing through the installer, and yeah, it doesn't like the unformatted disk, which is hopefully okay. Yeah, and now we got to format it ourselves. It drops us into a shell. I feel like I'm going to want a bigger root. Let's make it 10 gigabytes. Okay. We're going to need a bigger swap. I don't know, 4 gigabytes. Let's roll with this. I'm so bad at disks. So remember, we're just running off the DVD-ROM. We haven't installed anything, so I think I can do sun install to get back into the installer, or maybe it's going to start over. I'm not sure. We're back. I'm going to let this crank away. It's probably going to take a while, and I'll be back. Hopefully with Solaris 10. Yeah, glad I grew the root slice because the distribution is over 5 gigs. I think I went with 10. I'm going to plow through this for real this time, and I'll be back. We're about an hour in, about 80% done. I think maybe something might be wrong with that DVD-ROM. It sounds kind of crusty, and it's going a little slower than I would expect. And my terminal got all messed up because I exited and came back. And the ALOM is complaining about low battery on top of the installer screen. So yes, this is very nice. While that install is cranking away, let's talk about my future plans for this T2000. I like to use this old enterprise hardware in as close as of a production setup as I can to how it would be leveraged back in the day. I have dreams of Java, Tomcat, Beans. And while I was researching the history of that T2000, I came across an initiative Sun called N1. N1 was all about abstracting away data center hardware both for provisioning and management reasons, as well as being able to do grid computing, with dynamic scaling, applications being allocated to pools of resources, and so on. A lot of the cloud stuff we take for granted today. The data center hardware management aspect was taken care of by something called the Sun N1 System Manager. This diagram is very exciting for me. Multiple machines, at least 2 networks, multiple pieces of networking equipment, and I've got lots of Sunfires, and I've got lots of networking equipment. And it just so happens I found a copy of a bunch of the N1 tools up on the Internet Archive. So let's do a little preliminary research while Solaris is installing. I would like to eventually create this down here in my basement and get a full-blown N1 setup going. I was poking around in the ISO of the N1 System Manager disk, and to my great satisfaction, there are 4 different types of installers: Linux, Spark, Solaris x86, and Windows. The plan here is to do a little bit of research by trying, anyway, to get the Linux version installed in a VM and see how far we get. I've got the System Manager ISO mounted on a somewhat more modern Linux VM. What is this thing anyway? Ubuntu 20.04. So modern compared to the N1 initiative. So I'm in the Linux product installer directory. I should be able to just go with install, and I get input output error. Sudo? Same deal, input output error. It's not just a bash script, it's like a binary file. So I think I'm going to go with something a little more era appropriate, which would be Red Hat Enterprise Linux 4. And I'm going to try to install it in a VM. So I've got Proxmox here. This is a hypervisor that lets me run as many VMs as I want, basically, in my home lab. We're going to create a new one. Let's call it Red Hat Enterprise Linux 4. And I can't remember which one of these is right. I think it's this one. Briefly tried just the Red Hat Enterprise Linux VM once, and it didn't work unless I gave it a SATA disk for whatever reason. So that's what we're going to do. Let's give it 2 cores. 2 gigs of RAM is probably plenty. Let's fire it up. Ooh, okay. So far, so good. Graphical mode, see if it works. I also have a Solaris VM, but it's kind of like out of space. I need to recreate it, so we're going the hard way. So we're going to fire up this Red Hat Enterprise Linux 4 VM. I am not going to test the installation media. Here we go. Let's automatically partition. Hopefully it sees the disk. It does. So here's where it would usually fail if I use the default SCSI settings from Proxmox. Format away. The Red Hat installer experience is actually quite nice, especially if you think about what was going on at that time in Windows or whatever. Also, I realize it's kind of weird that I'm like setting up this Linux VM when I have all these Sunfires, but I just want to play around and see, if I can sit here at my machine and leverage a VM see if I can even get the system manager to do anything at all, and then decide, how far I want to take it in the future. Thank you for purchasing a subscription to Red Hat Enterprise Linux. You're welcome. It's rebooted, getting it set up for the first time. Pretty fancy little icon here. I'm going to run through this, and then I'm actually going to insert the system manager media as the CD-ROM on this VM, and we'll see where we get. The CD-ROM is in. I'm in the installer directory for Linux. Let's see. Input output error. I think maybe the ISO is corrupt, or it's in some sort of state Linux doesn't understand. I'm back on the Ubuntu machine, and all I'm trying to do is copy the contents of it that I've mounted over to a local temporary folder, and it just fails all over the place with input output error. So I've mounted it as executable and all those incantations, and no luck. So I guess we'll move on, and I'm gonna leave all this in here, I guess. I was poking around a little further at this ISO mounted on Windows, and in the scripts folder, we've got some Perl files and stuff that I should be able to open no problem with something like Notepad, and it can't open them. It complains, make sure the disk is in the drive you specified. So yeah, something funny going on with this ISO. Unfortunately, I'll have to find another one. After some more research, it's clear I jumped the gun a little bit on the N1 initiative, at least as it pertains to this T2000. If you look at the Sunfire datasheets, they usually have a management type section, and the T2000 only mentions its ALOM, its network attached ALOM, as one of the remote management options. Contrast that with something like the V240, that little one that was above it in the rack. It fully supports the N1 system manager, as does the V440, its bigger brother. You take a look at that datasheet, and it's identical to the V240. I've got two of those V440s, one of the V240, so I've got machines that can support this N1 stuff, or at least the systems manager, so you will be seeing this in the future, and we learned a little bit today. Let's see how that Solaris 10 install is doing. Solaris 10 successfully installed, but it's asking me for a login, which I never made. So I did a little Googling. I think it's root, and word on the street is that it's change me for the password. That didn't work. And it's complaining about repeated login failures, and it won't let me log in anymore. Okay. I must have set a password during the installer and totally forgot. Forget I showed you any of that. Check it out. Solaris 10 on the T2000. I've got future plans, but let's at least do something interesting with this thing right now and try to access its ALOM, that network attached remote management. I think there's like a web GUI. So we'll get that plugged into the catalyst switch, and we'll get another cable plugged into the catalyst switch going directly into a dedicated NIC on the back of the Proxmox VM machine, so I can pass it through to a Windows XP VM. I keep letting you guys down today. There is no web interface with the ALOM. That came with the ALOM, the integrated Lights Out Manager. That other silver Sunfire I showed you way back at the beginning of this video, it actually has an ALOM, so we'll explore that in more detail someday. But we're going to set up this ALOM access over the network anyway. Remember, I am on the network here, but I'm actually, at the end of the day, just accessing a serial port via my terminal server. This should let us just SSH in. So let's say SC setup. Setup SC. There we go. So I'm enabling the interfaces. SSH is fine. No email alerts. Let's just put it on 10.50. I'm configuring a lot more than just the network. Now it's just sitting here doing nothing. I don't know if it's restarting or what. I'll tell you what, I'm getting a new appreciation for truly remotely managing these machines. I walk over to the other room with the machines all the time to mess around and troubleshoot. And in a truly remote situation, you just wouldn't have that. I'm going to add a new user, and we will set its password. And I think it's a user perm lab admin, maybe? Okay, and it told us to reset the whole thing. So let's see. Remember, when you're messing with this thing, you're actually interacting with this little card, which is kind of cool. So I believe, theoretically, we can ping that ALOM network port, and we can. Can we get in? Oh yeah, I knew this was going to happen. The Linux machine I'm using does not like that old SSH stuff that's going on that ALOM. Look who's going to come in handy after all. That Red Hat Enterprise Linux 4 VM we just set up. That extra cable I plugged into the catalyst switch, which was going to the back of the Proxmox machine, I've got that network interface attached to this VM in Proxmox, and we should be able to SSH into the ALOM. We're in. So we can do admin, and here we are over SSH. Not a massive revelation, but really cool. I don't think I've ever set this up with any of my Sunfires. Remember, I was using the serial console before, and that's how I always administer most of my machines. But now this thing is on the RetroRet network at 10.0050. Lots more to do in terms of network design there, but it's working. This is cool. I wish I could show you how much power that thing was drawing, but I can't find my kilowatt anywhere to accurately measure that. So we're just going to have to trust the Sun marketing department when they say these UltraSPARC T1 processors gulp data and sip energy. We didn't do much from a software perspective on that T2000, but it will be making a return, and I'm glad I learned a little bit more about the N1 ecosystem. I definitely am going to get that going, especially since I have some Sunfires that can support it. Maybe the T2000 will run all that management software for us. And to be fully honest, I did not even investigate or troubleshoot the RAM issue where half of it is just not available. It does feel like a pretty lower level hardware fault, but maybe it's just the RAM sticks and I'll have to play around with that. And the Retro Rack got to flex its muscles a little bit, provide some value. That is a huge project and undertaking. I need a management network. You'll notice I just put the ALOM right on the default 10.0 network. I want to have different separate networks for management and some for the machines, maybe even segregated by machine type. Lots to think about there. But that's all coming in the future. If you liked what you saw, please consider subscribing if you haven't. Helps the channel grow. And I'm also on Patreon. I post behind the scenes type videos, what I'm working on, and the occasional early release. I hope you enjoyed learning about this T2000. I didn't know anything about it going in, did a bunch of research. Pretty interesting machine. I definitely want to get it serving some websites so that we can pressure test it and see what that cool thread stuff was all about. Thanks for spending time with me today, and I hope to see you in the next video.